Let's work on a Martin today, shall we? Let's work on the fanciest Martin, with the exception of certain commemorative models, of course. This, my friends, is a D45. Don't see very many of these. You see even fewer here in Canada. I've encountered all of 3 in my lifetime. I guess when you figure in the exchange rate and stuff, it just doesn't make sense for people. They tend to settle for a D28 instead and forego the pearl. This is a very expensive guitar. Let's talk about the history a little bit. This is a dreadnought guitar. Some people might not know what that means. Until recently, if you said the words acoustic guitar, the dreadnought shape is what would have popped into your head. For like 40 years, it was the most common design. When I was a kid in the 80s, you'd go to a music store, all of the new guitars looked like this, with rare exceptions. The HMS Dreadnought, which it was named for, was a British warship that was active during the First World War. It was built in 1906, and it was a pretty revolutionary ship at the time, in its armament and various other things. It was also physically very large for a battleship, and at the time of its construction, it was also the fastest battleship in the world. There's a whole class of ships that were named after it. The Dreadnought didn't see much action in World War I, but it did ram and sink a German U-boat. It's its claim to fame. Around that time, in the First World War, Frank Henry Martin, who was in charge of the Martin Company at that point, he was entering into a distribution partnership with the Oliver Ditson Company. It was a long-standing Boston music publisher that had been around for about 60 years at that point. They came up with a design for a much larger, more bulbous, deeper, gargantuan guitar shape. This thing is much bigger than the standard guitar of that period. Frank Martin was apparently aware of the world of naval design and called it a dreadnought in homage. So it's contemporaneous with a battleship. They made 3 models for Ditson. There was a D111, a 222, and a 333. They did not make very many of them. Ditson folded at the start of the Depression. They looked a little bit different from this one back then in that they were 12 fret models, meaning the neck joined the body at the 12th fret rather than the 14th, so there's proportionally more upper bout. Slightly more figure of 8 shaped. Anyway, along came Gene Autry in 1933. He was a cowboy superstar, singing cowboy. He sang Back in the Saddle Again. You might not know that one, but you would know his Christmas songs. Here Comes Santa Claus. That's Gene Autry. So he showed up and he wanted the biggest, fanciest Martin they would make. They decided to put the D45 into production, take the Ditson shape, and just bling it up. That's what makes it a D45. Loads of pearl inlay, but tasteful, if that's possible. It's a really time-consuming job doing this, inlaying all of this by hand, each little piece butted up against its neighbor in these double purfling line channels. So, personally I find this intersection between the fingerboard surround and the rosette here, it's kind of magical. I don't think you could design it better. They really get it right. I mean, the really wild thing is they did it in places that, unless you're the owner, you're never going to see. Like along the sides of the heel, not just the top, but also the sides and the back as well, facing away from the audience. So they made a few through the 1930s, really low production numbers, and they stopped in 1942 for wartime austerity. Those pre-war ones they're the most expensive acoustic collector's guitars in the world, and always will be. As musical tools, it's hard to say because there were so few of them. They didn't really get used in a lot of records. There's a bluegrass player named Red Smiley who played with Don Reno and a bunch of other people who recorded with his D45. Ernest Tubb had one. So it's sort of country music band stuff. In the late 1960s, Martin decided to start making them again, based probably on the fact that there was a cottage industry developing to take old D28s and retrofit them with pearl inlay by people who sometimes didn't have a real eye for it. I mean, there's some really nasty looking examples out there. What was ostensibly an upgrade can take thousands and thousands of dollars off the value of those things today. Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young were doing the vintage Martin thing at that point, and there was a bit of a market forming. Those guys picked up some of the first new ones. Neil Young is still plugging along with his. It's one of his main guitars. He's one of the very few people who actually takes one on tour. But anyway, they are rare. They are expensive. They are physically very similar to the other guitars Martin is making at any particular time. Maybe using a slightly nicer piece of wood for the top and back, but very standard otherwise. You know, they are very much of their period. This example is from 1975, and aside from a few little checks and the lacquer darkening and a couple of little cracks in the top that have been repaired, it is in otherwise really good condition. Again, people don't tend to strum these things as vigorously as they do a pawn shop guitar, so they do tend to look pretty good if you can find one. I'm not certain, but I think maybe this pickguard has been replaced at some point. These ones in the mid-70s, the black plastic ones, tend to just shrivel up over time into some really terrible shapes. It does have the classic Martin pickguard crack on either side, which has been repaired. And there's also some sort of stress fractures in the lacquer around it. And a little bit of a sort of a dent around it too, which suggests that maybe this is a replacement, which happens, you know. Other than that, it's in really good condition. There is a short split in the top here, which has been glued closed. It doesn't run all the way to the edge. It's an interesting place for this to open up, which suggests maybe someone hit it with something. The guitar has had a neck reset, which is actually pretty cleanly done. Great job on the heel. I can tell though, the lacquer here, this yellowed orangey lacquer, stops immediately at the body joint, and it's clean and white, where the fingerboard extension was glued down. I guess they got rid of that lacquer. Probably during the process of steaming it came off, which is a shame. I think maybe we'll rectify that. You can also see that there is sort of an angle that's taken place here. This is not just fall away, it's physically had to be bent down to meet the top. The frets in this area are also quite low, as if they've been dressed flat. So here's the thing. The action on this guitar is 7.5 64ths on the bass side, just a hair over 6 on the treble, which is, some people will deal with that just fine. If you're a flat picker doing bluegrass or country flat picking, some people can handle it. But in this case, it is a bit on the high side. Now, I don't know whether this is a result of someone maybe not quite hitting the mark on the neck reset, or if this is the effect of an additional 30 years after having it done the first time. I don't know. But the player, I think, is willing to try and rectify that, which is kind of a daunting consideration because I don't know how this thing was put back together. There could be surprises in there. Anytime you do a neck reset, you never really know what you're going to find. I think it's safe to assume that they did pretty good work because it's a clean job on the outside. You know, there are little scuffs here and there from the removal process, but on the whole it was done pretty well. So we're going to hope it was put together with the responsible type of glue, and we'll just do it like we usually do. This guitar has its original nut in place, and what's interesting about this is it's ivory. In 1975, the year of this guitar's manufacture, was the last year that Martin used ivory for nuts and saddles for most of their guitars. They kept on using it for the D45 for a few more years after that. They held on to some stock. But this is one of the last production ivory nuts. On the opposite side of the spectrum we have this one. This is a D21. It's a special edition of a rosewood guitar with the bare bones decoration of like a D18. This one is from 1985. It's got signatures of both Chris Martin III and the fourth inside there. The action on this one is very much like the previous. It's about 8 64ths on the bass side, 6 on the treble. I'm not sure if this one requires a neck reset just yet, because most of its issue lies in a neck with way too much relief. It's got a lot of forward bow. It's about, well, it's more than 20 thousandths with the strings on, and it's like 10 thousandths with the strings off, which is it's a lot. The irksome thing is that 1985 was the last year that Martin made guitars without an adjustable truss rod. A few more months and this thing would be just fine. I just give it a little twist and away we'd go. Maybe they would have made it this way in any case, because this is a throwback model. The D21 was around mid-50s to about 1970, I think. This was a limited edition. So I'm going to try and press out the extra relief using my neck heater here, which again was inspired by Dave at Dave's World of Fun Stuff here on YouTube. It is a hollow aluminum rectangle, piece of structural aluminum, that's got some resistance heaters glued inside using a high temperature silicone adhesive. It's stuff that's used for making gaskets. And that is controlled using a DC power supply. Heats up to about 160 degrees Fahrenheit, which is fine for this job. And I've got a couple of spacer shims on either side here, which will hold the bar off the frets and allow me to push this into a slight back bow, so that you have to overbend the neck to make it conform, and because there's a certain amount of spring back. So this will heat up for about 45 minutes or an hour. I will slowly start to increase tension on the clamp here, and then I'll let it cool off in the clamp for the better part of a day, just to try and keep this set. And we'll see what happens. Back to the D45. I'll do my customary thing where I'll measure the projected top of the frets to where it intersects with the front of the bridge, and we end up with just over 3/16 of an inch. I'll measure again with the string tension completely off, and that is just about 1/32 of an inch taller. So that means the front of the bridge dips about 1/32 of an inch under string tension. Interesting thing, for the bridge pins, they're still using just regular plastic. They do have an authentic pearl dot in them though. Yeah, the frets on this guitar are a little disappointing for an instrument with so little play wear. They've been dressed down at some point, especially this area over the body, which is not uncommon. But they're really flat. And down around 25 thousandths again, graduating up to about 32 in the lower positions, which is, it's okay. Now the owner of this instrument actually does repair work himself, and we were just going back and forth whether he wanted to do the work or whether he wanted me to do it, and he says, no, you go ahead, you should do it. So I guess at some point I am going to give this a bit of a refret, just because. Another thing you can see, there are areas along the binding where it's cracked through, which we'll probably want to put some glue in those spots as well, just to keep it from disintegrating any further. The main thing here is to get the fingerboard extension hot enough, but not too hot. Patience is important. If you go too fast or try to tackle this too quickly before it has enough heat in it, you end up tearing things rather than separating them, which is no good. And it seems like they have used a polyvinyl type adhesive, if I have to guess at this point, which I don't mind. Tight bond style material. Hide glue tends to have this sort of crackling kind of effect. It makes a snap, crackle, and pop as the knife goes in, whereas the polyvinyl glues tend to just sort of ooze out of the way. They're more like rubber. So I'll work from both sides towards the middle, and you can see I'm protecting the top a little bit with this thin piece of plastic. That just keeps me, because there's sort of a pivoting action here, if I'm not careful I could be scraping the edge of this palette knife against the finish, and I don't want that. I mean, there are already a few little marks from the previous removal, but, you know, do as little harm as possible. Once again, it's often easiest to get in near the fingerboard junction here with the neck and the body coming together, because you basically have to bend the fingerboard extension down to meet the top at this point, and there's usually a little gap here. Sometimes it'll be filled with various materials to disguise it, but that's often the best place to put the knife. And while the 15th fret is still hot from the iron, I can pop that loose. Yeah, you can see how flat it is. It's not going to produce a great tone. I don't really see entry points from the previous removal. Well, I guess I'll make my own. They must have filled them. Go in about 9mm. So on a Martin guitar, the dovetail is usually at or just slightly beyond the 15th fret here. So when I go in, I'll go straight down. I might have to take a little bit of a forward angle, like a degree or two, to hit the pocket that's at the end of the dovetail. I'm going to be using this 1/16 of an inch drill bit. Not only is it going to be a slight forward angle, but there'll also be an angle that mimics the dovetail inside the body there, sighting, sort of visualizing the center point of the heel. So it's got to come inwards a bit as well. There I can feel that I've gotten into the pocket. It slides right on down in the space between the end of the heel and the front of the pocket. No problem. Do that on this side too. I'll start off with the drill in reverse, which kind of acts as a pilot. These are my foam cutters from Hotwire Foam Factory. This is a 6-inch model, which I run using a DC adapter that just plugs right into the wall. They also have ones that are temperature controllable with a rheostat. I don't need that. I just plug it into the wall, set it, and don't forget it. I hang around while this is going on. Okay, I've applied some pressure to the bottom of the heel with the screw. I can see there's a gap forming between the fingerboard extension and the top of the body, and things are getting very loose, such that I imagine this is ready to come off. So I'll turn these off, and I'll pull them out. Again, using pliers on the actual stem of the device. Some gentle wiggles. I can see the corner of the binding here is stuck to the front of the neck. Means there's probably some glue that got in there. So I want to tape that down because I really don't want that coming loose. A little more upwards pressure. And there we have it. Free! Nice clean removal. There were some shims in here, but they did not use too much glue. Not great big puddles in the bottom or anything. So the extension seems to have been glued down with Titebond or something similar, but the actual dovetail was glued on with a protein-based glue, which is very nice. I approve. scraping off remnants of glue on the fingerboard extension. Then I'll do the sandpaper pulling to correct the neck angle. This removes more material at the end of the heel, and so tips the neck backwards in relationship to the body. The line of the frets ends up pointing towards the top of the bridge, thus reducing the action. People ask why I use a brush to remove the dust rather than sticking tape on the side or something. I don't know. Other than the first person I saw do this was Jeff Troggett back in like 1997 or something. And that's the way he did it. It's good enough for Jeff. It's good enough for me. And I don't get any scratches on the surface near the heel. So it works. It was decided that the fingerboard extension does need a wedge in this case. It's tipped too far downwards. So I'm using some veneer here, which I'll plane down to just over 1 millimeter at the end, about 40 thousandths or 45 thousandths. And tapered to nothing. I'll glue that down to the extension now because I'm going to be spraying some finish on the binding anyway. Might as well do this too at the same time. I'll dye this piece dark, which I think looks better than, well, it's less visually obtrusive than trying to match the binding. You may notice the wedge doesn't extend all the way to the corner of the heel, and that's because I've discovered that it's very difficult to make that work and end up with a predictable saddle height. This way it clamps down tight where it should be. The discrepancy in height doesn't seem to matter because the wedge is so thin. The gap virtually disappears. At this point I've already glued veneer to the cheeks of the dovetail, and I've perfected its fit in the body with sanding and scraping and lots of testing. I'll trim off the excess with a plane, being careful not to run into the heel. There is a little gap in the miter, the corner here, which is not uncommon. These things happen when the binding starts to shrink over time. The miters will sometimes open up. So I'm going to fill that with a little bit of goo, which is binding material that has been softened with acetone. Incidentally, don't store this stuff in a jar with a plastic lid, because the acetone fumes will eventually soften it and mold it in place so that you can never get the lid off again without doing this to it. Let's put a little blob on there and let that harden for half an hour or so. Changing my mind on the fly here, I've decided to leave the wedge this color, which is holly, which is white. It's not super big. I don't think it's going to be very evident, especially when I put the amber colored lacquer over top of this. I think it's going to blend in just fine, so we'll leave it like that. Took the neck outside, sprayed on a little bit of amber lacquer, let that dry, and then glued things up. Here's the D21 after the heat press. The relief in the neck has come down substantially. Previously it was around 21, 22 thousandths. Now it's 11. So it's basically half what it was. That makes it much easier to play bar chords in the center of the neck. The action has come down from 8/64ths on the bass side, 6 on the treble, to under 7 on the bass and 5 on the treble, which is much better, much easier to play. Maybe not perfect, but this again is one of those cases where player preference comes into it. Most people would play and say, well, yeah, that seems like a normal Martin action. Some people might need a lower action than that. This is, of course, a vintage style with a through saddle, which means that action adjustment happens on the top via filing it down. So we'll let the player try it out first and see what he thinks. There is a little bit of room to come down, just a hair. But this one, again, is on its way towards a neck reset. Could be 5 years from now, could be 10. Depends on things like, do we keep it strung up all the time? And exactly what do we want out of the guitar? But I will say, it feels like a 1950s guitar. They really got it right. When I pulled it out of the case, I thought it was vintage. And things like this pickguard, like where the heck did they get that plastic? That may have been sitting around for 30 years when they built this thing. Okay, the D45 turned out very nicely. As I mentioned, this guitar is going to get a refret. I'm not going to show that in this video. I made a whole video about refretting 2 weeks ago, so you can go watch that one if you haven't seen it. Action turned out great. It's about 5 1/2 64ths on the bass side, and just over 4 on the treble, which would be like 1.6 millimeters on the treble, 2.2, 2.3 millimeters on the bass side. Very nice, very comfortable, and with a saddle height of approximately 3/32 of an inch, which is kind of standard for these things. You don't want them too high, don't want them too low, obviously. Somewhere in the middle. Yeah, so I haven't even reinstalled the 15th fret yet because I'm going to pull these and do the final setup then, but sitting very nicely, and yeah, it sounds great. It really does.